Today's project is building this shaker bookshelf. It's a fairly simple design, so I took the time to go into more in-depth detail on my woodworking techniques. So I hope you'll follow along, build along. I'll have a set of plans available. I'm starting with building the sides of the case, rough cutting the parts to a little oversized. It's a lot easier and more efficient to square up lumber that is a few inches bigger than what your final size is going to be, rather than trying to square up a full 8-foot board. Once I had the sides cut down, I jointed one face flat and then headed to the planer to plane the other face parallel. I then went back to the joiner to edge joint one side square to the face. Once I had one edge straight, I ripped a parallel edge on the opposite side of the table saw. My final width for this board is 6 1/4 inches, but I'm ripping it a little wider at this point. This is a safety measure. If there's any gap between the boards when I go to glue them together, I want a little extra meat to be able to rejoint the edge. Once it's glued up, I will cut the final panel to its final width. In the past, when I've done a panel glue up, you've seen me use a domino or biscuit joiner to help keep the boards lined up with each other during assembly. In this project, I'm going to show you how to do a panel glue up without a domino or a biscuit joiner. I start by ripping some scrap plywood about 2 inches wide to act as cauls. Then I cover them with clear packing tape to prevent any glue from sticking to them. Then I took a construction grade 2x4, planed and jointed it square and cut it into 4-inch-ish wide blocks, and cut a notch about a 1/2 inch deep, a little wider than the bar on my clamps. This will help hold the clamps up off the assembly table. You'll see why this is important here in a minute. So I have everything lined up here, spread the glue and started clamping the panel up as normal. But instead of tightening the clamps all the way, I'm just tightening them until I feel some resistance. If it is too much pressure added at this point, the boards could slide and creating a ridge between each board. So here's why a spacer block is important. It allows me to slide the head of my clamp under the bar and clamp my cauls in place. I put cauls directly over the bar clamps, pushing the boards down flat and tight against the bar. I work my way down, putting a caul over each clamp. This is making sure my panel is glued up flat and without a ridge between the boards. Once I have the cauls in place, I add more parallel bar clamps and finish tightening them down to be sure I have good pressure across the joint. As the glue sets up to a point where it's no longer runny, I scrape off the excess. While the glue dries on the side panels, I move on to the top, bottom, and shelves using the same milling process as before to square up the lumber. Cutting it slightly oversized, flattening a face, planing it parallel, joining an edge, and ripping it slightly oversized on the table saw, and then do the final panel glue up. Alright, so I have my sides, top and bottom, and I'm going to joint them on the joiner, get them, make sure I have a nice straight edge, and then rip them on the table saw. I'm going to do them all at the same time, so that way I know for sure they're exactly the same width. Alright, so since I cut each one a little bit long, I am going to square off one end to make sure it's square. I'm going to first measure and mark where I want to cut the first board. I'll get that all lined up on one end. I'll leave it there and I'll go down to the other end. I'll just use my workpiece as an indicator to clamp down where I want my stop to be. And then I'll cut it, and then the next board will go right to that spot, and they'll be exactly the same length. Alright, now I'll do the same procedure for the tops and bottoms. Mark it to length. Set it up in the saw, set the stop, and cut both pieces to the exact same length. Alright, so now I need to cut some dadoes to accept the top and bottom pieces. And I looked at each board, and the nicer face I put down because I want it to face the outside of the bookshelf, and the inside is the less nicer face. And then since my top and bottom shelves have been sanded, they're not exactly 3/4 anymore, even though I milled them to 3/4. So I'm just going to set them up here. Use a scrap piece of wood to flush them up to the end. Make sure they're nice and flush. Then I'm going to mark on the back side where the dado needs to go. Alright, so to cut the dados, I'm just going to ride my router against this little plywood fence here that I'm just going to double stick tape down. I'm going to set it so it just covers up the pencil line. Check so it'll end up nice and smooth across there. Alright, so I have a pattern bit in the router just to ride along that. I'm going to bottom out the router onto the workpiece, then use my spacer to set the turret. I'll set my depth. And then one thing before I make the cut is I'm going to use my knife to sever the fibers there, try to prevent tear out on that end piece. You could also clamp a piece there to help prevent that too. Alright, I started out real gentle on that leading edge. That edge is where you're going to get any kind of tear out if it's going to happen. So I just started out real slow, and then once I got past that, it was full speed ahead to cut the rest of the dado. I took it in a couple of passes just to make sure I was being safe and not overworking the router or creating an unsafe situation. Alright, for the bottom shelf is a few inches up off the bottom, of course. So I'm going to use the shelf itself as a spacer. And then sandwich it between these two plywood runners. Since I used the shelf as a spacer, we'll guarantee that it'll be a nice tight fit. Alright, pretty good fit. Alright, so I have my plywood jig with a line of holes in it to set my spacing for the adjustable shelves. I'm going to line it up against here. Alright, so I have my router set up with a bushing in it. Same diameter as the hole in my jig. I'm going to use my spacer to set my depth stop. I'm halfway down, but I'm out of jig, so I'm going to move my jig down and help me get it lined up. That first hole is a 1/4 inch hole for that's my 1/4 inch bit. So I'm just going to drop my drill bit in there and line it up. And that will allow me to keep my holes exactly the same spot without any interruption. Lining it up perfectly. Alright, so I got the first line of holes in, and to make sure that the second line line up exactly with the first line, I'm just going to flip my jig over, and that will ensure that each hole is still in exactly the same spot. Alright, shelf pins are in. Now I want to make a decorative trim piece to go along the edges and across the top, and across that other far edge, that'll be over there. So back to the joiner. Alright, this board's a little bit out of whack, so to make it safe to rip on the table saw, I'm going to first joint one edge flat. Then I'll rip it a little wide to get both side pieces out of this, and then I'll mill it to its final width, square it up, and then cut it to its final width back up the table saw. It's a little multi-purpose operation that'll be a little bit safer than trying to rip a crooked board on the table saw. Alright, so time to do a dry assembly so I can get some exact measurements to fit the trim. Use my clamp here to help hold up the pieces while I get it all assembled. Just gently clamp it. Alright, I cut the bottom rail, cut this in nice and square. I'm going to flush it up on this side. Make sure I'm flush to the front of the top of the shelf. And even though in my drawing I know exactly what this length is, if anything got off just a little bit, it's a lot safer to take that measurement from your actual workpiece. So I'm flush on this end. Flush all the way across here, and then I got a good sharp pencil. Alright, and then it's just a matter of cutting to the line. I'm going to glue this bottom rail onto the bottom shelf. I'm going to put a little blue tape on this very end because I don't want to get glue on this because I want to be able to take it apart still. But I'm going to glue it together while it's in place. Well, it's test fitted together. That way I can make sure that this shelf is exactly centered on the bottom rail. This would be a super strong glue bond without those dominoes, but the dominoes just help with alignment. If you don't have dominoes, you'll just have to take a few extra minutes to make sure you're flush and aligned across the front there. Alright, now that I got the bottom rail glued to the bottom shelf and it's perfectly centered, I'm going to take it apart and sand the inside faces of each of these guys, and then I'll do the final assembly. And then once the case is assembled, I'll start to work on cutting the top rail and stiles to their final length. Alright, so by gluing the bottom shelf on there like that, you get this really nice seam that's super tight. Looks like just one piece of wood. The grain just kind of causes it to disappear. So that's why I glued it first instead of glued it on there afterwards. Just a nice clean seam. And that blue tape is so I don't sand where the stile is going to come down. So the trim on the side of the bookcase is going to come down and meet this. I don't want to sand that because if it rounds that over, then it's not going to look clean. There's going to be a little gap right there. All right, I'll sand it up. Time to assemble the carcass. All right, for the top rail, I'm going to find the center. All right, mark the top of my arch. Then the ends that I cut off, so like I cut this end off, I'm just going to use that as a spacer. All right, and then one of those thin strips that I cut earlier, I'm going to use as a guide to draw my arch. All right. Now we'll cut it out at the band side. All right, I took the bulk of the bandsaw marks out at the spindle sander, and now I'm going to use just this flexible sanding strip to refine the edge. Make sure you wear eye protection so you can see clearly. Basically what I'm doing here is cutting the ends of the stile square. Alright, I got my top piece and I'm just going to stick it down here at the bottom as a spacer so I can easily mark these guys to length. So I'm just going to put this guy up here. Pretty sure the glue is dry by now, so we'll just get rid of that. Let's come down here. Mark it to length. Alright, now I'm just doing the final assembly of the face frame onto the case. It's just a pretty basic glue up. Alright, same thing for the top. Just trying to gauge my glue usage. I want to make sure I have good coverage, but not so much that it runs down the cabinet on the inside. When I cut the stiles for the side of the cabinet, I cut them on the right-hand side of the pencil line, leaving the pencil. So that resulted in this being just a little bit proud, which is better than it being too short. So I'm just going to take my router with a pattern bit and run it along there and clean it up. Alright, so before I cut the rabbet on the back to accept the back, I'm going to use this clean edge to measure for my shelves. I'm going to take my total width and subtract 1/8, that way I don't have to jam them in there. Alright, when I glued up the shelves, I glued them up just a little bit wide and a little bit long, that way when it came time to cut them to their final size, I knew they could be exactly perfectly square and parallel and all that. So before I do anything else, I'm going to joint one edge, rip the other edge at the table saw, and then square off the ends to their appropriate length. I have these ends all squared up, stop block set so I can cut them all to the same length. Alright, so it's time to route the dado for the back panel. So I have a rabbeting bit with a bearing set up into it to trace along the side. Since this is only 3/4 inch material, it's going to be a little bit tippy, so I added a bigger base to help give me a little bit more stability. If I had something that was over 6 feet long to clamp on the edge of this to make it wider, that would be a lot more safe, but I don't, so I'm just going to go with this and take my time. Alright, so the router left this rounded over, so I'm just going to clean it up with a chisel. Alright, so my plan of attack for finishing is I'm going to finish the inside first, do that complete probably 3 or 4 coats, and then flip it over so the face rails are up, and then finish the sides and face last. That way I'm not trying to manage both sides at the same time getting into my wet work. Alright, for the back panel, since it's only about 3/8 of an inch thick or so, I'm just resawing some thicker material in half to save on material. I'll plane it to thickness and glue it up as a big full panel. Alright, I got my riser blocks back out. And I'm going to use some more cauls that are taped so the glue doesn't stick with it. That's mainly because the thickness of the back is too thin now to use in a domino for alignment. So to make sure they glue up nice and flat, I'm going to go back to the clamping the caul method. Alright, we got a nice flat panel glued up. Cauls are keeping everything nice and flat and in line, flush between each board. So once it's dry, I'm going to take it out of the clamps, sand it, and then rip it to its final width. I left it just a little bit long, so that way I can do an exact measurement of the inside of the case, rip it to its final width, cut it to its final length, and put a finish on it. And then the bookshelf is pretty much done from here. Alright, so I got the back set in place, and I know the bottom is 3/4 of an inch thick. So I set my square to 3/4 of an inch, and I'm going to mark the depth of the shelf. And I'm doing that because I don't want to have to try to figure out exactly how big this expansion gap is that I left all the way around. It's about a 1/16 inch, but I don't want to have to try to measure that because it's kind of a pain. So I'm just going to eyeball the center of that, and that will guarantee that I'm in the center of the dado. Give it a little mark just to make sure my drill bit doesn't wander. And then when I drill, I'm going to rock the drill back and forth a little bit to make it an oblong hole so it can expand and contract. Alright, there's my countersunk hole. We'll just attach it with a wood screw. Alright, and then I'll just work my way around. 3 screws on the bottom, a couple screws up the side, and 3 screws at the top roughly, just to space them out, just enough to hold the back on. It doesn't have to be super strong, just strong enough. Here we are at the end of another project. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll watch some of my other videos. Please like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Thanks for watching.